At first, building a business together seems ideal. There's trust, less risk of betrayal, and profits stay within the family. However, what happens when a small venture rapidly expands into a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar empire? The case of Andreen was complicated and unsettling. She went missing from her own home, and few believed she was still alive. However, without a body or strong evidence against the suspect, the investigation stalled. Months went by with no progress. The suspect seemed likely to go free. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a local rancher made a shocking discovery that changed everything. Andreen McDonald, born Anderson, was born on September 23, 1989, in Port Antonio, Portland, Jamaica. Her parents were Jamaicans who immigrated to the United States. She is the second of 3 daughters. Known for her friendly nature, charm, and good looks, Andreen had many friends and received a lot of admiration. While in high school, Andreen formed a close friendship with Andre McDonald. Andre was also born and raised in Jamaica. He was the only child of Marina and Everton McDonald. His parents eventually separated while Andre was still in school, and his father moved to the United States, where he remarried another woman. In the early 2000s, Andre moved to Florida to live with his father. He attended the International Technical University and earned an engineering degree. Instead of following a career in engineering, he chose to enter the military, signing a contract and serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. Throughout his military service, Andre and Andreen maintained regular contact through calls, messages, and visits whenever he returned to Jamaica to see his mother. Their relationship deepened over time, evolving into a meaningful, long-term partnership, and they realized they couldn't imagine life without each other. After graduating high school, Andreen moved to the United States to be with Andre. About a year later, they had a small wedding with only their closest family and friends. Shortly after their marriage, Andre was transferred from sunny Florida to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. He quickly began planning for their future, and Andreen enrolled at the University of Texas to pursue a degree in economics. In 2013, they welcomed their daughter. Around the same time, they started a business by opening their first. The assisted living is called Starlight Homes. The venture quickly gained popularity, leading them to open a second facility in another city soon after. Within a few years, their network of assisted living was generating substantial income. While Andre continued his military career and traveled frequently for work, Andreen took charge of managing their multi-million-dollar business's daily operations. They purchased a beautiful home with a pool in an upscale neighborhood in Behar County, owned several luxury vehicles, and planned to expand their business into nearby states. In 2016, after her father's passing, Andreen brought her mother from Jamaica to live with them. Her mother helped around the house and cared for their daughter when both parents were busy. A few years later, they bought her a small, comfortable house nearby and gifted her a personal vehicle. In early 2019, 37-year-old Andre, a major in the U.S. Air Force, chose to move to the reserves. He wanted to stay in San Antonio to spend more time with his family and get more involved in their flourishing business, easing the workload for his wife, Andreen. Their company, which consisted of a network of assisted living facilities, was thriving and had grown across the state to be worth nearly $1 billion. From the outside, the McDonald family seemed to have it all: success, wealth, a bright daughter, and a successful business. However, beneath this facade of prosperity, tensions were starting to rise, issues unknown to most people. On Friday, March 1, 2019, 29-year-old Andreen did not show up for work, and her phone was turned off. This was very unusual for her. Concerned, her assistant and close friend, Carol, reached out multiple times but couldn't get in touch. Eventually, Carol and 2 colleagues decided to visit the McDonald home to check on Andreen. After knocking for a long time without an answer, Carol refused to leave and began walking around the house to investigate. In the backyard, she discovered something troubling: a charred spot with a zipper partially sticking out of the ashes, suggesting someone had been burning clothes. But who would do such a thing, and why? Nothing else appeared suspicious from the outside. When Carol pulled on the back door and found it unlocked, she stepped inside cautiously. She called out for Andreen and Andre but got no response. The house was eerily quiet, as if they had just stepped out. In the bathroom, she spotted odd streaks on the light switch that appeared to be dried blood, along with dark stains on the floor that raised alarm bells. Carol recorded her observations on her phone and contacted the local authorities to report her findings. Officers arrived quickly and began searching the home. Their discoveries heightened the concerns. The carpet in the master bedroom had been scrubbed with a strong industrial cleaner, leaving a lingering chemical smell. There were faint blood spots on the floor and a smear on the doorframe. Detectives thought this could be the scene of a serious crime, but the minimal blood left some hope that Andreen might be alive. Andre was unreachable by phone, and his location was unknown. Initially, the whereabouts of their daughter were also uncertain, but authorities soon confirmed she was safe at her paternal grandmother's house. All three of McDonald's vehicles were present, two were parked outside and the third, a Chevrolet Malibu, was in the garage. The car caught the officers' attention because it was covered in dust, indicating it had likely been on dirt roads recently, with small gravel stuck in the tires. Although there were no clear signs of damage or blood, the state of the car raised suspicions. While investigators were still inspecting the house, the homeowner, Andre, suddenly appeared at the front door. He appeared anxious and confused about the police presence on his property. When questioned about his whereabouts and what had happened, Andre stated that he had spent the night looking for his wife. He mentioned several hospitals he had visited to check if Andreen had been admitted. A follow-up confirmed that Andre had indeed gone to those hospitals. Additionally, at one of the hospitals, when the staff mentioned that someone with the last name McDonald had been checked in, Andre reportedly turned pale, stepped back, and quickly left without realizing it was just another person with the same last name. From the beginning, Andre's actions raised red flags. The officers decided to question him to hear his side of the story. Andre explained that he and Andreen had a domestic argument, so he left the house to calm down. When he came back, she was not there. He mentioned that he tried calling her multiple times, and when she didn't answer, he took their daughter to his mother's house and kept looking for Andreen. It was hard to track his movements because his phone had been turned off since the night before and stayed off until he returned. When the officers asked why his phone was off, Andre changed his demeanor and said he wouldn't answer any more questions without a lawyer. At that point, investigators realized something was off. However, without strong evidence, they had to release him after the first interview. He was given a travel restriction order and placed under discreet surveillance at his home. It was later revealed that on the same day Andreen went missing, he had made several concerning purchases at different hardware stores. He paid in cash for items such as a shovel, large heavy-duty trash bags, a small hatchet, work gloves, duct tape, and fire starter fluid. Andre seemed to be trying to leave no trace by keeping his phone off and not using a credit card. Nevertheless, law enforcement tracked him down using security camera footage from those stores. Meanwhile, forensic testing confirmed that the blood found at the home belonged to Andreen. As suspicions intensified, the police decided to detain Andre for further questioning and obtained a warrant to conduct a comprehensive search of his home, including the seizure and examination of all digital devices. During a brief period when he went missing, Andre returned home but left almost immediately, unaware that officers were tracking him. He stopped at a gun shop, where he bought a large-caliber handgun and a substantial amount of ammunition, paying in cash. Strangely, after completing the purchase, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving the firearm and ammunition on the counter. His demeanor appeared disconnected, his eyes were vacant, and his movements erratic, suggesting a loss of touch with reality. However, experienced officers suspected this behavior was an act, possibly a prelude to a future defense claiming mental instability. Andre was arrested as he exited the store, and he did not resist. Formal charges were filed against him. During a physical examination, investigators discovered fresh scratches on his hands and forearms, which appeared to be fingernail marks. Although Andre could not provide a clear explanation for these injuries, those present recognized the likely cause, a struggle. Nearly 48 hours had passed since Andreen was last seen. The increasing circumstantial evidence made it hard to believe she might still be alive. A large-scale search effort was launched, involving law enforcement, volunteers, and hundreds of concerned citizens. Teams searched the areas around San Antonio, particularly the rural parts of Bexar County, hoping to find clues to advance the investigation. Sadly, they found nothing useful, neither in the fields, wooded areas, nor urban zones. Even a thorough examination of the digital devices taken from the home, including a phone and tablet, did not produce any promising leads. However, when investigators conducted a second, more thorough search of the vehicles and garage, the case changed dramatically. They found newly purchased tools and supplies that matched items Andreen had bought at several hardware stores. Then, in the trunk of Andreen's Porsche Macan, they discovered a shovel wrapped in plastic. The shovel had strange dark stains on it and several long strands of hair attached to it. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood and tissue on the shovel matched Andreen's DNA. The hair strands were also hers. However, the handle had been wiped clean of fingerprints. When questioned, Andreen claimed he had never seen the shovel before and suggested that someone must have planted it in his car. Despite the growing evidence against him, Andreen posted bail, set at $2 million, which he paid immediately, allowing for his swift release. Once home, he did not join the ongoing search for Andreen. He maintained his story that they had an argument, he left to calm down, and when he returned, Andreen was missing. Andreen claimed he tried to contact her afterwards, sending both voice and text messages. Some of these messages, which were found on his phone, contained emotional appeals, telling her their daughter was crying and urging her to come home. All of these messages were sent around midnight, after which his phone was turned off again. As the investigation into her disappearance continued without any leads, detectives decided to look into the McDonald family's background. They quickly discovered that their seemingly perfect relationship was misleading. In reality, their marriage was under significant strain for quite some time. Although they had built a successful business together that was growing rapidly and generating good income, most daily operations were handled by Andreen, especially while Andreen was serving in the military. During Andreen's 6-month deployment in Alabama in 2016, their emotional distance increased. Just before he was scheduled to return home, Andreen messaged him suggesting that they should go their separate ways and that he didn't need to come back. When Andreen returned, he found out that while he was away, Andreen had begun a relationship with other man, Aubin Hall, whom she had known since her childhood in Jamaica, also her ex-lover. She even has a tattoo on her arm that is the letter A, the first letter of Aubin's name, which she says was a mistake of her youth. Aubin and Andreen reconnected during one of Andreen's visits to Jamaica, leading to a rekindling of their relationship. He started visiting her in Texas, and they decided they wanted to be together, prompting Andreen to file for divorce. Under Texas law, Andreen and Andreen were required to divide their assets and business equally, which caused significant disagreement between them. Andreen felt entitled to a larger share because she managed the operations, while Andreen argued that everything belonged to him since he had funded the initial startup. About 6 months later, the divorce proceedings were put on hold as they appeared to have reconciled, deciding to give their marriage another chance for the sake of their young daughter. However, despite this outward appearance of stability, underlying tensions remained. Andreen had consistently opposed Andreen's trips back to Jamaica because he knew she would meet her former lover, leading to ongoing conflict between them, but Andreen continued to make her own decisions. Carol, Andreen's closest friend and the first to alert authorities after Andreen's disappearance, described Andreen as controlling, manipulative. He believed that the business, their home, and even Andreen herself were his possessions, citing that he had brought her to the U.S., helped her gain citizenship, paid for her college education, and financed their first assisted living. Shortly before she went missing, Andreen confided in Carol, saying, "If anything ever happens to her, just know it was Andreen." Just 2 weeks before Andreen disappeared, Andreen found out that she had secretly registered a new company in her name and moved part of their shared assets into it. This discovery likely felt like a betrayal and may have contributed to the tensions between them. On July 11, 2019, 4.5 months after Andreen went missing, a local farmer named Clifton Clavin was walking on his property on the outskirts of San Antonio. Since the land was only partially cultivated, some areas had become overgrown. While surveying the grounds for future maintenance, Clifton noticed a strong, unpleasant smell that seemed to be related to decomposition. Assuming it was the scent of a dead animal, he followed it, intending to bury or remove whatever he found. In the tall grass, he first saw a skull and some bones that looked like they belonged to a cow. However, under some scattered branches, he discovered the real source of the odor, a nearly fully decomposed human body. Clifton immediately contacted the police. The remains were recovered and sent to a lab for analysis. The body was found unclothed, and while it was confirmed to be a woman, investigators could determine little else initially. Given the circumstances, many suspected that this was Andreen McDonald, and DNA testing later confirmed those suspicions. The medical examiner was unable to determine a clear cause of death due to the advanced decomposition of the body. However, pathologists found injuries including trauma to the jawbone and a fracture at the base of the skull, which matched the type of harm that could be caused by the hammer found in Andree's car. Additionally, much of her hair was missing, which was initially alarming. When the examiners observed partial burns on her right hand, they deduced that someone had tried to burn the body, probably to destroy evidence. As a result of these findings, Andree was officially charged with the crime and taken back into custody. The area where the remains were discovered had been searched several times by law enforcement and volunteers, but the exact location was on private property, behind a fence about 60 feet from the road, making it inaccessible without a warrant. This is why it had not been investigated earlier. When Andree learned that Andreen's remains were found and that evidence indicated she had suffered blunt force trauma, he changed his approach. He informed investigators that he was willing to share everything in exchange for a lighter sentence. After talking with his attorney, Andree presented a revised version of events, painting himself as a victim. He mentioned his wife's infidelity, her attempts to take over their business with her new partner, and his fear that she would take their daughter from him during a divorce. Andree reported that Andreen had recently mentioned ending their marriage again and had allegedly threatened to leave him without anything and take their daughter with her. That evening, they had a heated argument. Andree claimed that Andreen grew aggressive and started hitting him, which led him to defend himself. During the struggle, he said she got a minor cut. Andree admitted to pushing her, causing her to fall, and he then kicked her several times and stepped on her chest to keep her from getting back up. When he heard footsteps in the hallway and his daughter calling for her mom, he panicked. He quickly left the room before the girl could come inside, picked her up, took her back to her room, and told her that her mom would come to check on her later. Andree maintained that when he left the room, Andreen was still alive, lying on the floor with only a slight injury. However, when he returned, she was in the same position but unresponsive. He believed that he might have unintentionally contributed to a fatal outcome by applying too much pressure on her chest during the struggle. Realizing the seriousness of what had happened, Andree began to panic. He took off Andreen's clothes and burned them in his backyard. He then moved her body outside the city, leaving it on private property behind a fence near the remains of a cow. Later, he went home and sent many texts to Andreen's phone, begging her to return, hoping to make it look like she had simply left after a disagreement. Following that, he woke his daughter and took her to his mother's house, asking her to care for her granddaughter while he searched for his missing wife. To further support his story, he visited several hospitals, pretending to look for Andreen. He nearly fainted upon hearing that a woman with the same last name had been admitted to one of the hospitals. By the time the police brought him in for questioning the next morning, they still lacked strong evidence against him, so he was released. After being freed, Andree began to seriously consider ways to ensure the body would never be discovered. He even thought about dismembering and burning it, then scattering the remains in different locations. To do this, he purchased a hatchet, a shovel, fire starter fluid, and heavy-duty plastic bags. The following day, he returned to the location where he had left Andreen. However, when it was time to execute his plan, he could not go through with it. Instead, he poured flammable liquid on her body and attempted to light a fire, but it quickly went out, only burning her hair and partially charring one of her hands. Andree later described the failure as leaving him in a state of utter despair. In a moment of anger, He grabbed an old hammer from his car and struck the body several times before regaining his composure and stopping. He then covered the remains with branches and cow bones. When asked why he visited a gun store, purchased a pistol and ammunition, and then left the items at the counter, Andreen stated he couldn't explain his actions. He mentioned that his thoughts were muddled, he hadn't slept for almost 2 days, and he wasn't thinking clearly. The trial faced significant delays, with hearings only commencing in January 2023. The defense team aimed to present Andreen as a victim of his circumstances. His lawyers argued that Andreen and her boyfriend were allegedly conspiring to eliminate Andreen from their lives to avoid splitting their assets during the divorce. Andreen McDonald provided a detailed account of what happened to his wife, but the condition of her body made it impossible to verify his claims. Forensic experts could not determine her exact cause of death or whether her injuries occurred while she was alive or if, as Andreen alleged, he hit her with a hammer after she died. What was evident, however, is that for 5 months, Andreen stayed silent, trying to conceal the crime and evade responsibility. In February 2023, many were shocked when Andreen was acquitted of first-degree murder charges. Instead, the jury convicted him of manslaughter and evidence tampering, resulting in a 25-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. His daughter was awarded to her maternal grandmother. The tragic saga of Andreen McDonald reveals the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences when hidden tensions erupt within a seemingly idyllic life. What began as a shared dream of building a family and a multi-million-dollar empire ended in betrayal, violence, and loss. Andreen McDonald's conviction for manslaughter and evidence tampering in February 2023, carrying a 25-year sentence, brought partial justice but left lingering questions about the truth behind Andreen's death. As their daughter finds solace with her maternal grandmother, the McDonald case stands as a stark reminder that even the most prosperous facades can conceal deadly secrets, urging us to confront conflicts before they spiral into tragedy. In 2016, 22-year-old Julia Enright was studying at the Massachusetts Medical College in the USA. At that time, she met a young man named Brandon Chicklese, who was 18. Brandon was a technology student, fulfilling his dream of becoming a heating and ventilation technician. Julia and Brandon were completely different from each other. Julia dressed and behaved as differently as possible, whereas Brandon dressed modestly and was kind and calm. Brandon grew up surrounded and cared for by his parents. He had been a Boy Scout for over 10 years, was described by those who knew him well as responsive and open. When he and Julia started dating, their union seemed like a real attraction of opposites. Gradually, they began an intimate relationship, and Julia involved Brandon in unusual forms of intimacy. Given their age, it was not easy to find privacy for such experiments, so Julia suggested using a treehouse owned by one of her friends. The house was abandoned and located in a wooded area just a few kilometers away from the suburban homes where Julia was born and raised. Over time, the owner stopped visiting the secluded place, and Julia began to use the house freely. She decorated her improvised shelter with chains and other paraphernalia, turning it into a base for their experiments. Her collection of unique objects began to form there. By the time Brandon first visited this place, an eerie atmosphere pervaded it, inspiring dark thoughts. However, he tolerated the oddities of his girlfriend, and they regularly met there. But as their relationship developed, Brandon increasingly felt that they were not right for each other. Eventually, he realized that further development of their relationship was impossible. Brandon suggested breaking up and remaining friends. Julia agreed. It seemed that both of them calmly separated, demonstrating emotional maturity. In 2018, Brandon lived with his parents in the small town of Rindge, New Hampshire. He had obtained the qualification for which he had studied and worked so long, becoming a heating engineer. He started dating another girl and was preparing to celebrate his birthday in July. It seemed that, despite his young age, he had managed to achieve something significant. He had an education, a stable job, and a relationship with a girl. He sincerely told his family that he felt happier than ever. Shortly before this period, Brandon thought he had gained the necessary experience and was ready to open his own business in heating systems. He began to take action, and everyone gave him great support for this initiative. Relatives, friends, and his girlfriend all recognized that Brandon was just the type of person who could successfully run his own business. Unfortunately, it was not destined for him to realize these dreams. On June 23, 2018, Brandon left home to visit relatives in Windham, New Hampshire. For this, he had to travel about 80 kilometers, just over an hour's journey. He left home at around 1 p.m., but he did not return to his relatives by evening. Any attempts to contact him were ignored. His family, girlfriend, and grandmother were understandably panicking. This behavior was completely uncharacteristic of Brandon. His mobile phone was turned off, a situation he had never experienced before, as he had a busy schedule and could receive calls from new clients at any moment. Unfortunately, in order to contact the authorities to report a missing person, they had to wait at least a day. On the morning of June 24th, Brandon's parents went to the police station. They presented their arguments in detail and were very worried because Brandon was not prone to spontaneous parties or meetings with friends, did not suffer from any mental problems. Generally should not have disappeared anywhere. Law enforcement began to search for traces of Brandon in Windham. However, despite their efforts, they could find no evidence that he had even reached the city. There were no traces of his car, including on recordings from CCTV cameras. Brandon did not buy anything in Windham, did not pay for gas with his card, and did not use his phone. In this state of having no leads, 5 days passed. Family members searched for him, but increasingly, the thought that they would not see their loved one again haunted them. Finally, on June 29th, a gray Honda Civic was found in the parking lot of the Hannaford supermarket on Route 202 in Rindge, New Hampshire. It was Brandon's car. It was unclear how the car appeared there, especially since it was unlocked and the keys were left in the ignition. This only strengthened the suspicion that something terrible had occurred. Brandon would never have treated his property this way. Such methods are often used by criminals to provoke the theft of a vehicle, leaving fingerprints behind to set up innocent people. During this time, relatives continued their search, distributing, pasting flyers throughout Brandon's hometown and the surrounding area. Unfortunately, all these efforts were in vain. On July 10, 2018, a random runner training in a forested area in Rindge made a horrifying discovery just 10 kilometers from the shopping center where Brandon's car was found. He located a human body, which was hidden in the bushes only tens of meters from the side of the highway. The remains of the young man were wrapped in tarpaulin, and his hands and feet were bound with tape. Given the condition of the body at the time of discovery, most of the flesh had rotted away, exposing the bones. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they immediately stated that this method of hiding the body was not chosen by chance. In fact, such extensive decomposition is an extremely effective way to get rid of evidence in the shortest possible time. Autopsy results showed the victim was Brandon Chicklese. It was believed that the detectives were dealing with a fairly experienced killer who knew how to evade justice. The perpetrator probably carefully studied related materials, and perhaps this was not his first crime. Suspicion only increased when investigators managed to find the shirt that Brandon had been wearing. It had several distinct cuts, apparently from a knife. Judging by this item of clothing, the victim had been stabbed 12 times. Unfortunately, the forensic expert could not confirm all of these wounds due to the body's condition. Perhaps they were more due to the high degree of decomposition. Thus, the expert could only speak with certainty about the traces left on the bones. For the same reason, it was not possible to establish the exact cause of death. It was possible that Brandon was tortured, but proving or disproving such guesses turned out to be impossible. No matter how hard the investigators tried, they were unable to find his mobile phone. It was apparently destroyed or discarded. Since the moment of Brandon's disappearance, they could not connect to his means of communication. This only confirmed the idea that the crime was committed by an experienced killer who knew that any information carriers and means of communication were compromising. This strategy was effective, as the police could not even establish the route Brandon had taken before his death or after the murder. Fortunately, the detectives still had access to the list of calls from Brandon's mobile phone before it was turned off. When they received this information from the operator, They discovered that the last call before his disappearance and the switching off of his mobile phone was made near the home of his ex-girlfriend, Julia. Investigators assumed he could have visited her before leaving. As soon as the patrol officers arrived near Julia's house, they immediately suspected something was wrong. There was an unbearable smell of rotting flesh. Even more shocking discoveries awaited within the house. Officers found decomposing bodies of animals literally everywhere in the rooms. Outside, they were wrapped in tarpaulin, and inside, in various containers, there were BDSM kits, specific paraphernalia, knives, and related photos. In fact, this house became the most horrifying location in the memory of all the participants of the first encounter with Julia. Julia lived alone in her father's house. She worked as a phlebotomist in a clinical laboratory, dealing with blood, collecting it for analysis, and preparing samples. Given the respect that doctors receive in the USA, it was a rather esteemed profession. Julia was always a peculiar person. As it turned out, these quirks went far beyond the bounds of normalcy. Her work was not just a way for her to help people and earn a living, it became something much more. During the day, she worked as a phlebotomist, but at night, she turned into another person. She became quite famous in the escort industry, acting as a mistress. Her friends and acquaintances knew of Julia's BDSM fetish, which she openly discussed. She claimed that only willing participants were involved in her activities, insisting that it was a form of entertainment and that all clients left satisfied. However, none of her acquaintances suspected the dangers involved. Despite her fears and risks, she decided to take a big step, even posting an ad on a specialized website inviting everyone to engage in play involving knives and blood. According to the description, it was supposed to be BDSM domination, which involved lightly injuring the client and allowing them to bleed. This was a specific category of entertainment. There would always be clients willing to participate. Moreover, no one should care about what happens in someone else's bed if it is done by mutual consent. However, such activities always suspiciously resemble a front to cover up darker deeds or even a trap for naive partners. As it turned out, Julia had her own skeletons in the closet. She didn't just associate her life with blood, it was more akin to an obsession. In fact, she had a fascination not only with blood but also with dead flesh. She had a real collection of dead animals displayed in jars, among them large specimens like ravens. Additionally, almost constantly in her courtyard lay decomposing animal bodies, which she wrapped in tarpaulin to speed up decomposition from the heat and then used their bones for her artistic compositions. Despite the nightmarish aspects and especially the terrible smell, Julia perceived some sort of beauty in this and embodied it through her art. Unfortunately, her vision of beauty proved too perverse and cruel to earn her a place among artists. Moreover, Julia had a whole collection of vials filled with blood and used condoms. She was obsessed with serial killers. She once even described a kind of ritual in which she personally participated. When a whole group of people gathered, they acted out scenes with vampires and actually drank some of each other's blood. Despite these suspicious hobbies, Julia had friends and willingly demonstrated her creativity. She always claimed that she had no talent in art, but in this way, she expressed her vision of the world. In fact, time and time again, Julia showed her friends the remains of animals, which were laid out in specific patterns. Of course, most people were concerned about where she got all these bodies. To such questions, Julia always answered briefly that everything necessary for this so-called art was found in the forest or on the side of the road. Julia insisted that she did not harm living beings but found and used the bodies of dead animals. Considering that in everyday life she was very quiet and avoided conflicts, people believed that this was just an oddity. Apparently, Julia's inner circle didn't know about Jeffrey Dahmer. This infamous man once started with a similar fixation. He also collected dead animals and became obsessed with the study of remains. He described his passion as an alternative vision of the world or creativity. Like Julia, Dahmer surrounded himself with things of a frankly creepy nature, and naturally, this could not end well. Julia kept a detailed diary in which she described her life and her activities exploring her own psyche. It seemed she was not fully aware that her hobbies looked strange and provocative. She continued to view them as creative pursuits and spoke somewhat arrogantly about people who did not understand art and beauty. However, there were less philosophical notes in the diary. She described bloodthirstiness as a charming character trait and revealed her unhealthy attitude toward death. From the very first entry, she constantly talked about her obsessive desire to kill a person. Julia considered it the height of bloodthirstiness, a manifestation of insatiability, which excited and attracted her. Julia repeatedly mentioned that she was driven to this monstrous act by a certain hunger that arose with every thought of killing a person. All this frightening data was obtained during the investigation. The longer the police dug to understand who Julia was, the more shocked they became. For the detectives, it became obvious that they had encountered a potential serial killer. The biggest source of incriminating data was her mobile phone, which was taken for examination. As it turned out, shortly before Brandon's disappearance, Julia had met a new boyfriend named Jonathan Lind. They were both rather dark personalities, making them perfectly suited for each other. The night before Brandon's disappearance, immediately after the incident, Julia sent Jonathan a message containing the alarming phrase, "bloodbath." Detectives immediately noted that the treatment of Brandon's body was identical to the method Julia had used to accelerate the decomposition of animal remains. Even more unusual was the message sent to Brandon the day before his disappearance, in which Julia asked if he would come to visit her treehouse. The investigation established that a few weeks before her death, Julia was actively trying to improve her relationship with her ex since there were difficulties with the current girlfriend of Brandon. In fact, they were on the verge of breaking up due to her betrayal. Probably as a result of this, Julia managed to draw him in. In the end, he agreed to meet her at a kind of BDSM club, perhaps thinking of this visit to his ex as an act of reconciliation. Immediately after Brandon agreed to Julia's invitation, she wrote to her new boyfriend Jonathan that there was a surprise for him. By communicating with the neighbors of Julia, the police easily uncovered details of her intimate relationships and preferences. She openly shared this information with the entire neighborhood and seemed to even speak with pride about her activities in the intimate sphere. Gradually, the detectives came into possession of a business card on which she suggested playing with a knife and blood. There were witnesses who testified that Julia and her new boyfriend liked to cut each other during intimate. However, she herself would discuss it openly without the slightest embarrassment. When she ended up at the station for questioning, she laid out all the details. Surprisingly, after this conversation with Julia, the police officers let her go. She managed to convince them that despite her oddities, she was not involved in the murders and that there was no concrete evidence against her. According to Julia's confession, she truly intended to meet Brandon on that fateful day, but he never showed up. She sent him a message in the evening, but the guy never responded. Finally, one of the police officers decided to verify the information and found other messages from Brandon that Julia had not mentioned. Those messages made it clear that the former lovers had indeed met. This fleeting lie raised suspicions that the detectives had encountered a manipulative individual who needed to be further investigated. These guesses turned out to be correct. The more the police talked to Julia, the more she changed her story. Eventually, she admitted that she did meet with Brandon that evening. According to her, after a short conversation, he left to buy banned substances for the night, but the guy never returned and did not answer her calls, so she just went home. This also turned out to be a lie, as the guy did not use banned substances. After the lie was revealed, the detective spoke to the neighbors of Julia again, and they found out about the treehouse in the woods that Julia had turned into a BDSM headquarters. The officers focused on finding this hideout and managed to arrive there with her new boyfriend. It was obvious that the house had been thoroughly cleaned. There was even new furniture and a new carpet. Everything looked suspicious, as if someone had tried to cover up evidence of a crime. The carpet attracted the most attention. It looked out of place in this treehouse, as did the cleanliness, especially in sharp contrast to the chains and jars of blood and animal bodies. As soon as the carpet was lifted, it became evident that it was covering very large, washed-out blood stains. Similar traces were found under the floorboards. Blood also was on the steps and tree trunks. They had obviously tried to wash it off, but in vain, so they simply covered it with a carpet. It resembled a bloodbath. Judging by the number and size of these marks, it was clear that they were related to a deceased victim. Julia insisted that all these traces belonged to dead animals she had collected on the street. After searching the car, blood was also found there. Julia denied that Brandon was ever in the car or that they met in the treehouse on the day of the disappearance. However, DNA testing showed that she was lying, as most of the traces belonged to Brandon. As soon as the detectives presented this evidence, she changed her story again. Julia claimed that after her meeting with Brandon, they got very drunk. He went to get banned substances, and then they met in the treehouse. According to her confession, her ex-boyfriend attacked her, demanding intimate, but Julia resisted, justifying herself by saying that she had a new boyfriend. However, this did not help, as Brandon attacked and tried to abuse her. According to her, at that moment, she had no choice. Julia managed to reach for a knife, which she always carried on her belt. She claimed to have stabbed Brandon several times in self-defense. Afterward, Julia, in a state of shock, admitted that she could not even move from the spot, so she remained beside the wounded Brandon for about 40 minutes. During this time, he simply bled out. Julia did not call for help or contact the police. Instead, she turned to her boyfriend to ask for assistance in getting rid of the body. She did not want to go to jail for self-defense, believing that they would not believe her. By this point, investigators no longer believed a word she said. Additionally, the more than a dozen blows found only on the shirt were too much for self-defense. Her story about needing help from her new boyfriend was questionable, as he was known to be a sadist. It is unlikely that he was brought in solely to assist with getting rid of the body. Most likely, he also participated in the crime. However, no solid evidence was found. Julia ended her story by explaining how the body was wrapped in a tarpaulin and discarded off the highway. She insisted that the fabric was used only to disguise the remains. The police were convinced that she could have deliberately used a proven method to conceal human bones to fulfill her morbid fantasies. After all, maniacs are often prone to collecting items that remind them of their crimes. Julia's behavior did not resemble self-defense but clearly indicated an attempt to escape justice. Julia and Jonathan not only disposed of the body but also destroyed Brandon's mobile phone, attempted to eliminate traces of blood in the treehouse. They covered for each other when communicating with the authorities. There were no signs of struggle on Julia, and she was not morally traumatized by the events. Immediately after they disposed of the body, she and Jonathan simply went out for sushi. The detectives were finally able to confirm their suspicions after reviewing Julia's diaries. Judging by the last entries, she perceived Brandon's murder as a kind of gift for her new lover, who shared her peculiarities. Jonathan actively denied his involvement, insisting that he did not report the incident to law enforcement because Julia was scared and convinced him not to do so. She was absolutely certain that she would avoid punishment, as expressed in her diary in a rather crude manner. Additionally, Julia wrote that the torture and murder gave her body pleasure. It is evident that she would not have stopped there. In fact, each subsequent entry in the diary was more alarming than the last. The notes fully revealed the true nature of her interests. Julia repeatedly robbed graves and brought bones to add to her disturbing collection, which her boyfriend seemed not to be bothered by at all. In the first trial, Julia was charged with first-degree murder, and despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against her, she continued to insist that she was the victim of abuse. After her arrest, Jonathan, who was detained 2 weeks later, was charged with concealing evidence of a crime and perjury. He also did not admit guilt. Both were imprisoned and denied bail while awaiting trial. Julia's first trial was scheduled for November 2021. The prosecution insisted that the defendant planned Brandon Chickley's murder as an act of togetherness and a way to fulfill her vicious desires. Julia easily managed to lure him into a trap by promising intimate. Presumably, she brutally dealt with Brandon, then enlisted her new boyfriend to help get rid of the body and the traces of torture. Julia's deviant interests exceeded all reasonable limits. Shortly before Brandon's murder, she went to a family planning clinic to have an abortion. The staff confirmed that she persistently requested to keep the fetus, even attempting to bribe the doctors to allow her to take the unborn child home. It is obvious that the fetus would have become another exhibit in her collection. Of course, the lawyer tried his best to whitewash the image of the defendant and her accomplice. However, considering all the accumulated evidence, this proved to be quite difficult. Their only tactic was to smear the name of Brandon. The defense attorney tried to argue that Brandon was an abuse and a cruel, aggressive person, but all of this sounded extremely unconvincing. When Julia spoke at the trial, she cried while recounting how she was attacked by Brandon. She claimed that she managed to defend her honor only after she stabbed him in the throat, but she could not explain why she inflicted many other wounds. Despite the desperate attempts of the lawyer to defend her, the prosecution successfully painted a truly horrific image of Julia. The jury was adamant and found Julia Enright guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder, considering it an unintentional crime. In March 2022, the court announced the sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Upon hearing this decision, Julia burst into tears again, tearfully expressing that not a day goes by that she does not regret meeting Brandon. Julia never admitted guilt, calling the outcome of the trial a misunderstanding. Jonathan Lind, found guilty of giving false testimony, was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 7 to 9 years.
On December 5, 1975, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a married couple was on their way home from a school basketball game. At around 8:30 p.m., the wife decided to visit her niece, Lindy, who lived nearby. They parked their car near the apartment complex, and she got out to quickly check on her niece, leaving her husband in the car. However, when she reached the apartment, she discovered that the front door was unlocked. Cautiously peering inside, she saw a knocked-over floor lamp and other items scattered around. The disarray of the apartment indicated that a fight had occurred. When she noticed strange stains on the floor resembling blood, she stepped into the living room. What she discovered would haunt her forever. In the center of the room lay Lindy, with a knife stabbed into her throat. Overwhelmed with panic, she ran out of the house and hurried to her car to call the police. The police arrived at the scene and were baffled about who could have had a conflict with the young 19-year-old girl, who had recently gotten married. They wondered what could have led to her brutal murder. Lindy Sue Beekler was born on January 31, 1956. Her parents divorced when she was very young. She was raised by her mother. Her father moved to the suburbs, remarried, and had a son with his new wife, making him Lindy's half-brother. From a young age, Lindy was curious and cheerful. She loved exploring new activities. Lindy participated in the Girl Scouts, went hiking, enjoyed boating, and joined different clubs. Lindy was a positive person who made everyone feel good. Her bright smile encouraged others to smile too. Above all, she treasured her family. One of her favorite things to do was curl up on the couch with her mother. In those moments, she felt like the happiest person alive because her mother was not only a caring parent, but also her best friend. Recently, Lindy had been employed at a flower shop, where her boss and co-workers described her as very hardworking, humble, and somewhat shy. However, once they got to know her better, Lindy revealed her fun side. She had a great sense of humor. Despite this, she preferred not to be the center of attention. Lindy married at a young age despite her insecurities. Her husband, Philip Beekler, was 5 years older than her. They first met when Lindy was visiting her sister. They were instantly attracted to each other. On October 19th, the year before the attack, Lindy and Philip tied the knot. The ceremony was officiated by Philip's grandfather, who blessed their union, saying they were perfect for one another. Philip worked part-time as an agent at a car rental company while studying art at Millersville State College. It appeared he was inspired by his parents. His mother owned an art gallery and was deeply passionate about art. Lindy is just 2 months away from turning 20 and has recently begun to embrace adult life as a married woman. Philip and Lindy were happily living together in their small one-bedroom apartment. However, Lindy felt uneasy being home alone. She never felt safe since they moved in. She constantly sensed that someone was watching her through the sliding glass door, though she couldn't pinpoint anyone specific. Overall, she was simply afraid to be alone in the apartment. In January, they planned to move to a new place in Manor Township. In the evenings, Lindy got home from work a couple of hours before her husband. She would lock the doors and turn on all the lights, carefully listening to every noise. During the investigation of the crime scene, the police found that Lindy had been stabbed 19 times. The attack involved 2 different knives. One knife, which the attacker had brought, was never found, while the other knife came from Lindy's kitchen. This kitchen knife was still in her neck when her aunt discovered her. Lindy's body showed 11 stab wounds to her chest and upper abdomen, 5 to her back, and 3 to her neck. One of the stabs had pierced the carotid artery, causing her to bleed to death. Experts noted that Lindy had defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she fought fiercely for her life until the very end. The apartment was in chaos, with blood everywhere. It appeared that, after finishing her shift at the flower shop, Lindy had stopped to buy groceries, as bags of food were left on the kitchen table, still unpacked. This indicates that the attack occurred right after she returned home. Several pieces of evidence were collected at the crime scene. A shoe print, likely size 10 or 11, was discovered on the kitchen floor. This print suggested that the attacker was likely a large, strong man. Another piece of evidence hinted at a possible motive, although Lindy was fully clothed when found. Detectives suspected she had been abused. Male fluid was discovered on her underwear, which could provide the perpetrator's DNA. However, in 1975, forensic capabilities were limited. Experts could only identify the attacker's blood type and compare it with that of a suspect, but they needed to identify a suspect first. Unfortunately, that was where the evidence trail ended. The police also lacked the perpetrator's fingerprints, as the knife handle found in Lindy's throat was wrapped in a kitchen towel. The news of Lindy's tragic death devastated her family. Relatives called Philip at work, telling him he needed to come home immediately because something had happened to Lindy. As he rushed to their apartment, he feared the worst, but he could never have imagined that his beloved wife had been brutally killed. The police did not allow Philip inside the apartment, leaving him confused about what had happened. They kept him in the hallway until he found out the heartbreaking news that Lindy was dead. Seeing how pale he became, medics gave him a sedative, and the police took him to his mother's house. For about 4 days, Philip felt lost. He couldn't tell whether it was day or night or how much time had passed since the tragedy. He had to sit and wait for answers while the police continued their investigation. Detectives interviewed her co-workers and employer, and none of them noticed anything unusual about her behavior. Lindy went to work at the flower shop in a good mood. That day, she did not appear anxious or scared. There were no dissatisfied customers. Everything was completely normal. Lindy excitedly shared with her colleagues about the Christmas gift she had prepared for her husband. That evening, she calmly got into her car, waved goodbye to her colleagues, and drove home. Unbeknownst to anyone, it would be her last evening alive. Around 5:30 p.m., after work, Lindy went to the car dealership where her husband, Philip, worked to pick up his paycheck. She cashed the check at the bank and then went to a nearby grocery store to buy groceries, filling 4 bags. Afterward, she headed home, parked her car, and began unloading the bags. It seemed likely she would need to make 2 trips. At that moment, someone likely entered her apartment and attacked her. Detectives speculated on this since there were no signs of forced entry, and Lindy was not the kind of person to let a stranger into her home. This led the police to believe that Lindy knew her attacker, felt safe being alone with them. The first person the detectives looked at as a suspect was the victim's husband, Philip. However, the family and friends insisting that Philip and Lindy were a happy couple. Philip deeply loved Lindy and felt incredibly lucky to be dating her. Amazed that someone so beautiful would be interested in him, he said she changed his life for the better by inspiring him to enroll in college and pursue painting. In return, he supported her dream of opening a flower shop. When Lindy was killed, it devastated Philip. He couldn't bear to stay in their apartment, where every corner reminded him of her, so he moved out. Although he had a strong alibi, investigators were slow to clear him as a suspect. Following Lindy's death, Philip felt lost. He wandered the streets for hours, dropped out of college. They had dreamt of finishing their studies, starting a family, and planning their future together. Now, in an instant, all their dreams collapsed, like a sandcastle washed away by the tide. Philip had to completely rebuild his life in light of this tragic reality. The second suspect in the investigation was Bob, Lindy's direct supervisor. His favorable comments and positive evaluations of Lindy took an unexpected turn. The day before her tragic death, Lindy baked him blueberry muffins for his birthday. Bob spoke so highly of her that police began to question whether he had developed an inappropriate attachment. At 35 years old, single, and without an alibi, Bob caught the attention of the authorities, prompting them to scrutinize him more closely. The pressure became overwhelming, leading him to hire a lawyer to safeguard his privacy. Bob passed a lie detector test and fully cooperated with the police. After clearing both Lindy's husband and Bob as suspects, the police interviewed hundreds of people, including friends, family, and acquaintances. Yet they found no one who might have wanted to harm her. Neighbors were also questioned, but no one reported seeing anything unusual that day. The atmosphere in the apartment complex grew tense as residents began purchasing weapons for protection. While violence in other neighborhoods was concerning, the murder of a young woman next door felt particularly alarming. A note from the police was taped to the Beechlers' front door, indicating that it was a crime scene and restricting access for local residents. This served as a constant reminder of the tragedy and the unsettling reality that the killer might still be nearby. The investigation hit a dead end. The only clue from neighbors was a report of an unfamiliar dark-colored car parked outside Lindy's house at the time of her death, with its headlights on. Even if the driver was not involved in the crime, they could have been a witness. However, locating the car proved to be impossible. Neighbors' descriptions varied widely, and no one could recall the license plate number. Meanwhile, the police station was overwhelmed with calls. Although some leads seemed promising, none led to concrete answers, forcing investigators to develop their own theories. One theory suggested that Lindy was being stalked by someone who observed her and her husband's routines, waiting for the right moment to attack. It's possible the intruder entered the apartment while Lindy was unloading groceries, or that it was a burglar who planned to steal valuables, but panicked and assaulted her with a knife when she unexpectedly returned. However, the burglary theory was weak because Lindy's purse, containing her jewelry, was still in the apartment. Additionally, the nature of the abuse assault did not align with typical burglar behavior. The police eventually identified an 18-year-old suspect, who was arrested. He was known for committing terrible acts. He had already attacked 4 women, binding them with their own clothing and stabbing them with a screwdriver. In one instance, when a victim attempted to flee, he chased her in his car and tried to run her over. The location and timing of his crimes made the police suspect his involvement in Lindy's attack. However, investigations revealed he was not connected to that incident, as he was at work that day, supported by multiple colleagues. In December 1976, Lindy's family visited her grave to pay their respects. What they found left them in shock. Someone had vandalized the grave. The headstone was covered in knife marks. Pieces of it were scattered nearby, and the rest was splattered with red spray paint. The police took this incident seriously, as they believed the vandal might have also been involved in Lindy's death. The use of a knife suggested the vandal was aware of how Lindy had died, and notably, only her grave had been targeted in the entire cemetery. Since the family had kept the burial location private, it indicated that the vandal had intentionally sought it out, possibly by following family members. Unfortunately, the detectives were unable to identify the culprit. An entire year went by without any answers, leaving Lindy's family in a state of confusion and distress about what happened to her. In the following years, detectives looked into many people who were connected to Lindy's life. They examined her mother's boyfriend, looked into frequent customers of the flower shop, and even explored possible connections to serial killers active in Pennsylvania at that time. In their search for answers, they even consulted psychics. Despite these efforts, the case of Lindy Beechler's death remained unsolved. 25 years after Lindy's tragic death, the lead detective retired, leaving the Lindy case as one of the oldest unsolved cases in Lancaster County. In 2006, the investigation into Lindy's death was transferred to a special group in Pennsylvania that focused on old unsolved cases. utilizing new techniques and perspectives. However, they too were unable to make any progress. Decades after his wife's death, Philip Beekler discovered the DNA analysis techniques used to convict the perpetrator. He believed these methods could also be applied to his wife Lindy's case. In 2019, police applied these techniques to analyze DNA from the crime scene and created a composite sketch of a potential suspect based on the DNA. A computer program produced two portraits. One depicted how the suspect likely appeared at the time of Lindy's attack, and the other showed what the suspect might look like at age 65. While the portraits weren't exact representations, they revealed important details about the suspect, including fair skin, brown eyes, dark hair, and possible distinctive features. Despite this progress, locating the suspect was still difficult. The DNA sample was analyzed by C.C. Moore, a well-known American genetic genealogist. She discovered that the DNA found on the victim's underwear in 1975 was connected to a small town in Italy. Moore invested a lot of time identifying individuals with Italian ancestry who were living in Lancaster County at the time of Lindy's murder. She traced the migration patterns from this small Italian town to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. After ruling out over 2,000 individuals with similar genetic profiles, she was able to use public records to narrow it down to one suspect. This led her to identify the likely killer, a man named David Sinopoli. Investigators checked the name against existing databases, but found no records. This man had never been noticed by the police before, and his name was not on any suspect lists. However, while reviewing the case files, detectives learned that David lived in the same apartment complex as the Beeklers. To establish his connection to Lindy's death, they needed to obtain David's DNA. On February 11, 2022, David was at Philadelphia International Airport waiting for his flight. To pass the time, he bought coffee, not realizing that police were observing him from afar. After David finished his coffee, he threw the empty cup into a trash bin. An officer then discreetly collected the discarded cup and placed it in a plastic bag for further examination. The cup was sent to a lab for DNA analysis, which revealed a match between the DNA on the cup and the seminal fluid found on Lindy Beekler's underwear, confirming that David Sinopoli had been at the crime scene. Additionally, 2 drops of blood found on her stockings matched his DNA, providing further evidence. Initially, investigators thought the significant amount of blood at the crime scene belonged to the victim. However, they also considered the possibility that the perpetrator had injured himself and left behind traces of his blood. On July 17, 2022, around 7 a.m., police arrived at David's home, a few miles from the site where Lindy was murdered years earlier. He did not resist arrest, but his wife, who had been married to him for 36 years, was completely shocked. They had 3 children and 9 grandchildren, all of whom were unaware that they had been living with a criminal and murderer. Following the tragic murder of 19-year-old Lindy, David had lived quietly for nearly 47 years, never revealing his past and believing he would escape punishment. After David was arrested, Lindy's family had a reason to celebrate. Unfortunately, many family members never got to see justice served. Lindy's father died in 2000, and her mother followed in 2007. Her husband, Philip, was still alive and had remarried around 1990. Even though he hadn't initially planned to, he wanted to honor Lindy's hopes for him by finishing college, attending graduate school, and becoming an artist, which he accomplished. Eventually, he was able to let go of the tragedy and move forward with his life. The day after David's arrest, the police held a press conference announcing that they considered the case of Lindy Beekler's murder closed. Friends and family of David struggled to believe he was involved, thinking there must have been a misunderstanding. However, it's painful to acknowledge that this man evaded consequences for his actions for nearly 50 years, living as if nothing had happened after taking a young woman's future. Years went by, but the police never forgot about the case and continuously worked to solve it. Eventually, justice was served. David Sinopoli was taken into custody without the option for bail. Initially, he strongly denied any connection to Beekler's death, but as the trial date approached, he changed his mind and agreed to a plea deal. On October 19, 2023, 48 years after the crime, David Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. He received a prison sentence of 25 to 50 years. The judge mentioned that considering the defendant's age, this effectively amounted to a life sentence. David never explained why he killed Lindy by brutally stabbing her 19 times and violating her body to fulfill his selfish desires. Lindy and David were neighbors in the same apartment complex, but there is no evidence that they ever interacted prior to the crime. This leaves the true motives behind his actions a mystery, even to the police. It's possible that David was strongly attracted to her and eventually succumbed to his hidden urges. His primal instincts took over, which is why he is now in prison.